listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me, non-judgmental talk about infidelity with Dr. Marie Murphy. If you're looking for new perspectives on complicated relationship issues, you've come to the right place.
Days go by, they're crawling by.
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Marie Murphy. I'm a relationship coach, and I help people who are engaging in anything they think counts as infidelity to deal with their feelings, clarify what they want, and make decisions about what they're going to do. No shame, no blame, no judgments. I believe that no matter what we have going on in our lives, we all deserve guidance and support that respects the fullness of our humanity and the complexity of our situations. And that's exactly what I provide. If you'd like my help sorting out your infidelity situation, you can schedule an introductory coaching session with me through my website, mariemurphyphd.com. All right. Today, we're going to talk about perfectionism and what perfectionism has to do with romantic relationships. And I do want to say that today's themes are closely related to last week's episode about dealing with guilt and shame. For various reasons, I'm not going to explicitly make links to last week's episode today, but I do want to point out that the topics in today's episode are certainly related to last week's topics. Okay, I know there are a lot of definitions of perfectionism out there, and many of them hold that perfectionism is about striving to meet very high standards or striving to be perfect. And many of these definitions suggest that there may be some positive aspects to perfectionism, but it may also involve a lot of self-criticism, fear of failure, and all or nothing thinking. And I don't hate that definition of perfectionism, but I want to suggest that there may be more to it than that. And there may be an even more useful way of conceptualizing perfectionism. And here's what I think that is. Perfectionism is the belief that you should be perfect and that if you were perfect, you would be happy. It is predicated on the belief that perfection is something that's obtainable and valuable. It's the belief that you would be more worthy, more lovable, more fundamentally acceptable if you were perfect. And for some people, it's the belief that the only way to be okay as a human is to be a perfect human, right? Now, here's the crazy part. You can hold these kinds of beliefs while also rationally understanding that there isn't really such a thing as perfection or that perfection is impossible to achieve. I'll say that a little differently. It is possible to intellectually understand that there is no such thing as perfection and to also believe that you are not a fully lovable, acceptable, worthy human being unless you achieve some form of perfection. Let that sink in for a moment. When I talk about that definition of perfectionism with clients, they sometimes protest and say things like, well, it's really important to me to hold myself to high standards. And I think it's important that other people should hold themselves to high standards too. Because what would happen to the world if we didn't hold ourselves to high standards? And to that, I say there isn't necessarily anything wrong with wanting to hold ourselves to high standards. But that's really different from believing we will only be good enough or worthy or acceptable or okay once we've hit a certain target and if we continue to hit certain targets. We can be worthy and whole and acceptable as we are and also decide to grow and evolve and continue to quote unquote better ourselves. We can consider ourselves great as we are and also set standards for ourselves that we feel good about and strive to uphold them. But believing we aren't good enough yet is not all that different from believing there's something wrong with us now or believing we're deficient as we are, right? There's a difference between trying to uphold standards that we value and believing we're not okay if we don't uphold those standards. And this can be applied to how we think about other people too. When we think of other people as only being good enough if they meet certain standards, we're essentially thinking of them as lacking something in the present. And is this a helpful way to think about ourselves or about others? More often than not, when we find fault with someone, whether it's us or someone else, it doesn't feel great for us. And when we think there's something wrong with us specifically, that sort of thinking usually creates feelings of inadequacy or shame or guilt or deficiency. And like I talked about in the last episode, to touch on this briefly, when we feel guilt or shame or not enoughness, we tend to take actions that don't help us create more of what we ultimately want to create in life. We think that we can motivate ourselves by holding ourselves to high standards and expecting the best from ourselves. But if the implication is that we aren't good enough unless we meet those standards, then we're in trouble. Because sometimes we don't meet our standards. Sometimes we simply aren't ready to meet our own standards. Sometimes our standards are just insane, and the problem is what we expect of ourselves in the first place. Or sometimes our aim is perfect, but we're shooting at the wrong target. Sometimes there are things we need to learn or see or understand before we can do anything differently than what we're currently doing in life. And moreover, we're human, and being human means being imperfect. And that's only a problem if we make it into one. Of course, we do tend to make it into a problem, and here we are. We tend to think that it's better to be good than not good. We tend to think it's better to be perfect than not perfect. And sometimes we think it's really bad if we aren't good or aren't perfect. But what if we didn't have to see things that way? What if we weren't so consumed with fear of being bad or imperfect, and so attached to a desire to be good or perfect? What if we trusted that we're fundamentally okay and that our worth or our value or our acceptability are inherent? Some people love to say that if we were to think about human life this way, no one would be accountable for their actions and nobody would do the right thing, whatever the right thing may mean. And everyone would be totally selfish and self interested, and basically the world would completely fall apart. And there are a million things I could say in response to that. But I think the most important way to respond to these kinds of ideas is to ask ourselves if they are true for us. What happens for you when you believe you are fundamentally okay? What happens when you believe that you are worthy of acceptance and love and belonging simply because you exist? What happens when you believe that you don't have to be perfect in order to respect yourself? Ask yourself these questions and see what you find. But I will tell you that when we have a rich, robust sense of self worth that isn't conditional, we're able to take responsibility for ourselves and our actions in a way that we really can't when we're terrified of being imperfect or being rejected or being blamed or considered bad. When we love ourselves unconditionally, we can be radically accountable for our behavior because we aren't worried that having done something that we don't think of as all that great or somebody else doesn't think of as all that great is a reflection of our fundamental worth. So, what does all of this have to do with relationships and with infidelity? Well, perfectionism can show up in our relationships in all kinds of ways, but I'll focus on two common manifestations today. The first one looks like this. We may believe, in essence, that if we aren't perfect in our partner's estimation, then we won't have their love or their acceptance or their appreciation or their commitment to us or whatever it is we want from them. In other words, we believe that components of our relationship, or perhaps the existence of the entire relationship itself, is predicated upon us being perfect, which may translate in our mind into us being the way our partner wants us to be, into being perfect for our partner. The underlying fear is often that we might not be worthy of our partner's love or affection or commitment or interest or desire or attention. We may not be thinking this way consciously, But upon close examination of our beliefs, many of us have a deep fear that we're unworthy of love. And the idea that we might not be worthy of love or desire or interest usually feels terrible. So many of us go to great lengths to avoid these feelings. And the specific actions we take to try to avoid these kinds of feelings may vary. But one thing a lot of people do is attempt to do whatever they think their partner wants them to do and not do the things they think their partner doesn't want them to do. We may do this consciously or we may do this not at all consciously. But whether we're doing it consciously or not, when we attempt to meet other people's standards, we may completely abandon our own standards or fail to establish our own standards in the first place. If we're continuously attempting to anticipate and respond to other people's needs, we have a lot less bandwidth available to identify and then meet our own needs. And when we neglect ourselves or deny ourselves in these ways, we not only corrupt our relationship with ourselves, but we ultimately compromise our ability to participate in a relationship with anyone else, which is a great irony, of course. We think that if we're perfect for others or we please others, then we'll create a connection with someone that will help us feel okay, help us feel whole, help us feel good, help us believe that we're worthy. But what actually happens is we sell ourselves out for something that doesn't even exist. There is never going to be a relationship with another person that convinces us that we're fundamentally lovable or worthy or attractive or desirable or interesting or worthy of commitment or however it is we want to feel. The only person who can convince ourselves of these things is us. Yes, it's great when our partner loves us and desires us and finds us interesting and amazing and attractive and all of that other stuff. But it isn't their job to convince us that we're amazing. It isn't even their job to think that we're amazing 100% of the time, right? Put in different terms, it isn't our partner's job to convince us that it's okay for us to think of ourselves as whole, as good enough, as acceptable, as worthy. It isn't our partner's job to continuously assure us that we're lovable and fundamentally okay, right? It isn't our partner's job to make us understand this about ourselves either. No matter how great of a relationship you're in, it's your job to feel good about yourself. It's your job to love yourself. It's your job to believe you're enough. We tend to think that we need to get those messages from other people in order to believe them. But ironically, even if other people tell us these very things, it won't matter unless we are already willing to believe these things are true. If we don't believe we're lovable or worthy or enough, we're always going to be seeking affirmation from others and we're never going to be able to get it, right? Even if we don't believe we're seeking confirmation that we're perfect in any literal sense, this is similar to perfectionism, or this is a type of perfectionism insofar as we're always seeking external confirmation that we're okay or we've met the standards and therefore we're acceptable. And this sort of quest is like trying to fill a bottomless pit. When we don't know that, though, we may pursue relationships because we think they're going to be the one that makes us feel like we're finally truly lovable, or finally and truly desirable, or finally and truly okay or good enough. And when we're on this kind of a quest, it can have all sorts of ramifications for how we live out our love lives. On the other hand, when we know that we're already okay, we're able to engage in our relationships very differently than when we are desperately wanting to be good enough or perfect and fearing that we aren't. Okay. Another way that perfectionism often shows up in relationships is when we believe that we have to live up to societal standards about how relationships are supposed to go or what relationships are supposed to be like or not be like in order to feel okay about ourselves. as you are no doubt aware, there are a lot of ideas out there in the world about what relationships are supposed to be like and not. So, just for instance, some people believe that it's not okay to initiate a divorce or initiate a breakup. A lot of people believe that cheating is bad and participating in any form of infidelity is bad. And some people think it's really sad or even bad if a marriage ends for any reason other than death. Now, we may know that not everyone believes these things. And we may also know that plenty of people live out their romantic lives in ways that don't conform to societal expectations. But even if we know these things, we may still fear that people we care about will shun us if we don't do things the way they think we should. And there are lots of examples of what this may look like, right? So often people say to me, well, if I got divorced, I would be the first person in my family to ever get divorced. And I don't know how people would treat me. And a lot of people tell me, if my kids found out about my affair, I'm afraid they would hate me or they would judge me or our relationship would change irrevocably for the worse. Or if I leave my relationship, if I'm the one who initiates the breakup or asks for the divorce, everyone who knows my partner and me will blame me and think of me as the bad person, right? Or if my partner, who is currently married to someone else, gets divorced and we end up together, no one in their circle will ever accept me. I'll always be thought of as that bad other person who broke up like the marriage or the perfect family or whatever. Right. Now, even though we may know intellectually that sometimes people do these things and it works out just fine or even better than fine, we may still fear that people we care about or people we know will judge us or reject us if we do things they don't approve of. And we may still believe on some level that if other people disapprove of us, that will mean that there's something fundamentally wrong with us, that we're not perfect. And even worse, we're fundamentally unacceptable and not worthy of love and belonging. Even if we don't literally think those things in those words, we may have these fears lurking in the back of our minds, these sorts of fears lurking in our thoughts. And when we do, there are multiple ways this can get us into trouble. For one thing, if you're constantly trying to live up to other people's standards, you may be neglecting your own truths. You may be compromising your own standards, and you may not be allowing yourself to be fully human. When we make big choices about our romantic lives that are driven by a desire to be acceptable to others, we run the risk of making decisions that really aren't right for us. That's actually a very significant risk that we run. Nobody's, I really want to make it clear that, often we do this because we think we will be happy if we just do the thing that other people expect us to do or don't do the thing that other people think we shouldn't do, right? There's no fault in thinking this way. The only problem is it doesn't always work out well. And as we're doing this, we're usually not doing it all that consciously. We may not be aware that we're deeply afraid of not being acceptable to others. And we may not see how this fear is driving our decisions. And if this is part of what's going on with us, we may be totally mystified by our own decisions and our own unhappiness and the patterns that we keep finding ourselves in our lives. Another thing we need to remember is that it wouldn't be possible for us to live up to other people's standards or any kind of external standards, even if we devoted ourselves to that task completely. Other people's reactions to our behavior are never guaranteed. Other people's standards change. We're never assured of getting other people's approval, even if we do all the things they want us to do. So if we attempt to secure our own sense of okayness by living up to other people's standards, we'll continuously find ourselves chasing a moving target. So what are the opportunities here? How can you make this information actionable for you? Well, number one, I encourage you to get really curious about your own desire to be seen as good enough or acceptable or worthy or perfect. whatever perfect may mean to you. Now, many of us have gotten the idea that it isn't really cool to be concerned about other people's opinions. And so we may tell ourselves that we don't really care what other people think of us. And that may be true to some extent. It's true that we all have different thoughts and we all care about different things to different degrees. So it may be true that you don't care that much about what other people think, at least at some points in your lives or in some areas in your lives. But I want to caution you here. I want to tell you that sometimes when we're willing to look for them, we find that we do have unconscious fears about being accepted that are lurking in the corners of our minds and causing a whole lot of trouble for us. And it's better to be aware of these kinds of fears than to try and tell ourselves we don't care about what other people think and pretend that these fears don't exist for us. Unacknowledged fears can cause a whole lot of trouble. Acknowledging our fears may be uncomfortable, but ultimately, it's so much more productive to do so. Now, on the other hand, of course, some of us are very conscious of wanting the approval of others. Some of us are well aware that our entire self-concept is predicated upon what other people think of us. And either way, there's great value in starting to become more curious upon the ways in which our sense of our own worthiness is contingent upon meeting external standards. There's so much value in becoming more conscious of the ways we may believe that our fundamental acceptability as a human is dependent upon other people's approval of us. There is so much to be gained from investigating the extent to which we may be trying to achieve some elusive form of perfection so that we may feel okay about ourselves. When we start to see how perfectionism operates for us, we can see how we engage in our relationships in a completely different light. We can begin to see how our desire for approval may be driving a lot of our actions in relationships. And we may begin to see that we're not ultimately getting what we want out of our relationships when this is our motivation. Now, the solution to this, broadly speaking, is to cultivate a sense of self-worth isn't contingent upon being perfect. A sense of self-worth that isn't contingent upon other people's approval or meeting external standards. A sense of self-worth that embraces the fullness of our humanity, right? And doing this can be a project for sure, but it's a project that's well worth the investment of our time and energy. What could be more worthy of our time and energy than that? We'll talk more about how to shift your relationship to your self-worth in future episodes. It's definitely a topic in and of itself. But for now, I encourage you to start to get really curious about how perfectionistic thinking may be present in your mind and how it may be impacting your romantic life. And I especially encourage you to do this if you believe you're someone who doesn't really care about other people's opinions, right? That's a great story to tell ourselves. And it may be true to an extent, but it may also be a defense mechanism that you're using to protect yourself against your fear of what other people think about you. And acknowledging that fear and exploring it is going to be so much more productive in the long run than avoiding it and trying to shield yourself from it forever. Okay. If you want my help looking at how all of this is operating in your life, if you want my help in investigating how perfectionism is interfering with or shaping your experiences of your romantic relationships, let's work together. It is one thing to hear me talk about things on the podcast, and it's another thing to examine your own life and apply the concepts I talk about and the tools that I teach to change your own life. So if you want my help doing that, you can schedule an introductory coaching session with me through my website, mariemurphyphd.com. I offer confidential, compassionate coaching via Zoom, which means we can work together no matter where you're located. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. If you have enjoyed what you've heard, I would love it if you would rate and review the podcast on iTunes. Have a great week. I will talk to you next time. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me with Dr. Marie Murphy. Make sure to click subscribe to get updates on our latest episodes.